Different ASEAN states, all different ASEAN states will volunteer troops with the benefit of subsidized training from ASEAN. So ASEAN countries will contribute to the training of these troops. There are bases across Southeast Asia. We can make use and leverage on the existing bases that are already there. And what we hope to have is a standing force that can be deployed at any time. We think that this mirrors the policy that UN has, whereby a lot of peacekeeping troops are trained in return for the countries contributing them. So we see a lot of troops being contributed by developing countries as well as developed countries, so that they can alleviate the kind of spending they have on their own militaries. What we believe that the goal of this particular peacekeeping force is that they are there to keep the peace. They are strictly non-interventionist, and what we believe is that they are there to enforce ceasefire, and they will only enter the permission of the sovereign state. So essentially, this is not an intervention force, this is a peacekeeping force. In my speech, I'm going to answer 4 questions. Firstly, discussing as to why this is necessary. Secondly, why are alternatives not particularly good. Thirdly, why we think this particular peacekeeping force is uniquely better, and why we think this will increase the legitimacy of ASEAN. Before that, closing.
So are they only going to operate in ASEAN, and does it need consensus between the members on how to deploy it?
Okay, so they will be able to operate overseas if ASEAN determines that there's something that is worthwhile. We also think that they will be deployed as if within ASEAN they agree and the particular country is okay with the particular troops coming in. So why do we think this is necessary? We think that within Southeast Asia itself, as well as the region around it, there are hotspots of conflict within Southeast Asia. For example, in southern Thailand, there's a bit of conflict over there. Rohingyas, unrest in Myanmar. We also saw a lot of unrest in Muslim Mindanao in the Philippines. We think that these are conflicts whereby lives are constantly being at stake and constantly being lost, and the governments who are in these places, yes, sure.
If you are going to only deploy these troops with the permission of that particular state, assuming that there is a dictator, you really need to send out peacekeepers.
Okay, sir.
Are you really just going to walk away?
Okay, sir. Ultimately, what we believe is that at the very least, there will be some action that's being done to stop the violence, and we think that that's the best compromise here. I'll go and explain later on. What we argue here is that lives are constantly being lost. We think that the governments are being forced to quell the resistance on their part because they need to maintain some semblance of legitimacy, right? And the problem is that there's often no way out in terms of these conflict areas, because number one, the governments are likely to give in, and the alternatives are problematic in the sense that the international community doesn't really do anything about it either, right? They condemn it, but they don't do anything about it because number one, there is usually there's a worldwide military austerity, there's fatigue in terms of engagement in intervention, or even in terms of helping different places where there needs help. And we saw that even in the immense violence that we saw in Syria, there was an absence of action, right? So we say that usually there is no particular action that is taking place, right? And we argue that often the international forces are deployed or even brought to these places to just become peacekeepers, because there's a lot of mistrust of the international forces, and they perceive them as interventionists and not as peacekeepers, and they perceive it as infringement of their sovereignty, right? So we argue that conflicts are continuing to occur and violence is occurring, but there's no presence of peacekeepers in order to be able to enforce things like ceasefires so that the violence can be stopped and there's some negotiation that takes place, right? So why do we think these alternatives that they suggest, for example, intervention, intervention by ASEAN, is particularly unsuitable? Because the reality is that on places where they have intervened, where they have foot on the ground, we think that the cultural differences, especially since the makeup of the United Nations peacekeeping forces are largely from the African nations, are largely from South Asia, where they are trying to get a lot of cheap training from the UN. The demographic of those troops are particularly unsuitable for operating within Southeast Asia, right? We think that this is partly because, number one, there's a lack of cultural understanding in a predominantly Muslim region, but more importantly, on the second level, there's immense mistrust of UN peacekeepers, given their track record in refugee camps all over the world, where we saw a lot of these South Asian peacekeepers engaging in crimes within these refugee camps, committing things like rape. We think that these they contribute to how these alternatives are not particularly good in terms of enforcing this sort of peace within this area. But more importantly, why do we think this peacekeeping force will be useful? Because the argument, and what I think they're trying to get at, is the idea that, well, if there's a conflict over there, why aren't you doing anything about it? We think the reality is that the ASEAN community, given its policy of non-interference, is never ever going to do anything about it in the first place. Within the international community, if it does intervene, we think that's a good thing, but we don't think it's within the purview of ASEAN to do anything about it. But more importantly, what we argue is that in this situation, we think that peacekeepers are more likely to get deployed rather than to wait for the international community to decide for over a long period of time while lives are being lost. So we think that this is a good stopgap measure in order to deal with the civil conflict that exists, right? Because what usually happens is that they reject UN forces, peacekeepers, because they perceive it as a potential for escalation of UN involvement into intervention, right? And what we say is that they are more likely to consider to bring in ASEAN troops because this is the ASEAN that is vowed against intervention. That they know that this is a group of people that both the rebels as well as the state can agree on, so we can have a ceasefire. And we think that more than not, peacekeepers are the key cornerstone to allow ceasefires to happen in the first place. If there's no entity that can agree on, and the perception of the international of the rebels of the state is that the international community is against them, we don't think that this is something that will allow the peacekeepers to come in and stop the violence and a ceasefire to occur. We think that if we have this peacekeeping force that is represented by ASEAN, and ASEAN has this long stoic policy of non-intervention and is built within the constitution, we think that this gives a lot more belief by these different parties within conflict in Southeast Asia to not want to believe that this peacekeeping force will be neutral and accept them so that ceasefires can occur. We think that's far better than their solution. Moreover, what we argue is that it allows for a lot swifter deployment in terms of dealing with humanitarian problems, right? For example, we saw a lot of natural disasters happening in the region, and we saw that right now there's a lot of help going on, but we think that this will allow for swifter deployment. We think it's a lot better. But more importantly, on the last level, we believe that this increases the legitimacy of ASEAN as a whole. Because right now, Mr. Resource, given that all these states have some involvement within ASEAN, all decisions within ASEAN will be considered a lot more seriously. Because any particular conflict that happens will have some form of involvement or some sort of cost to that particular state. We think that's particularly important because now ASEAN is seen as a lame duck organization. Albeit a bit, sometimes maybe because of its non-intervention policy. But we think that in this situation, at the very least, there's some cost. And now, what usually states will have is there's more of a vested interest in conflicts. They are not within their, there's not close to their hearts, right? We think that this increases the legitimacy of ASEAN because now they're more likely to care more likely to go out and discuss whether this particular issue is worth dealing with. At the end of the day, we believe that this particular peacekeeping force is a force for good because now there is an option on the table that will allow for the violence to be delayed, violence to be stopped while we find a solution in the long run. Thank you.
Okay, to thank the Prime Minister and welcome the Leader of the Opposition to respond.
Ladies and gentlemen, ASEAN is a body that was established for the cooperation between many isolated, non-homogeneous states in terms of what they view as a thing that is a legitimate form of governance. You have a rainbow democracy in the Philippines. You have a pseudo-Islamic government in Malaysia. You have extremely Islamic governments like Brunei. And you have semi-dictatorial governments like Singapore, ladies and gentlemen. In those instances, we don't necessarily think that in any instance whatsoever, that a consensus can be reached under the side of government in terms of what they can standardize as a standard of when do we intervene and whether or not we believe that we can tell dictators or even leaders of countries, no matter what the standard of government is, that what you're doing is wrong, let us in. And even offering to have peacekeeping, even when they say no, is something that triggers countries into not negotiating with the ASEAN bloc. We think that's harmful under that side, ladies and gentlemen. We think economic cooperation under the side of opposition helps more, ladies and gentlemen. I'll tell you why more later on. When the entire world is able to pressure governments into accepting certain terms and conditions, while ASEAN can be seen as the balm in that instance, ladies and gentlemen, offering cooperation and letting them know that there is a friend in the world that they can negotiate and cooperate with, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's extremely important for ASEAN to stay in a non-interventionist stance in this debate. Done with our characterization. So, but before I go on to my substantive material, I have a few issues of contention coming from opening government. The rest of my rebuttals will be integrated. Number one, very, very, very important is that does the international community really not provide any alternatives whatsoever? We think that's a complete lie under the side of opening government to tell us that apparently the international community sits by and does absolutely nothing where Burma has a military junta that oppresses its own people. We didn't see that from the international community. We placed sanctions and trade embargoes onto Burma, and we're very happy to condemn the actions of Thailand and Thaksin Shinawatra, ladies and gentlemen. We think these actions already happen under status quo. We think the international community does help, guys. Look, but secondly, ladies and gentlemen, the issues of trust regarding peacekeepers and whether or not the UN can act as a body that people in, say, Malaysia trust, because apparently people coming from Africa are people that we don't trust, right? But ladies and gentlemen, let's really analyze who is being used when it comes to ASEAN or the UN putting out peacekeepers to helping individuals. Let's take a case example of the UN helping in Bosnia, ladies and gentlemen. The United Nations oftentimes use regional representatives and troops in regards to making people on the ground a lot more comfortable. For example, in Bosnia, regarding that conflict, it was a Muslim conflict. We used troops from Qatar, Malaysia, or Indonesia to make sure that the people in Bosnia felt a lot more comfortable with people intervening in their country and keeping the peace, ladies and gentlemen. We think the United Nations can make that consideration. The value of having people in the region and a familiar face is not mutually exclusive under that side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's actually important. But before I go to my substantives, yes.
The only reason why the violence in East Timor was prolonged was because both sides couldn't find a suitable party to enforce the ceasefire that was present. If we had this regional peacekeeping force that was explicitly non-interventionist, wouldn't it be more likely that the violence could have been stopped in East Timor and less lives were lost?
No, that's not what happened in East Timor. The reason why the conflict in East Timor prolonged for so long was because nobody wanted to intervene, because everybody thought that in any instance they wanted the United Nations to do their job, ladies and gentlemen. In that instance, we think it's extremely important that in any instance that if the international community has some degree of action on countries like this, then there must be a regional actor that acts as a cooperative balm in that instance, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's extremely important. Let's go on to my substantive
clarification.
Firstly, sit down. No. Why does it harm ASEAN and its members' ability to meaningfully engage with each other even in times of crisis like this, ladies and gentlemen? Number one, we think it more often than not creates isolation of states that may not necessarily conform with the standardized structure of what you may think is democratic or acceptable under your interventionist policy. More often than not, the conclusion to that is that states might even pull out of ASEAN or the cooperative efforts of the ASEAN community, ladies and gentlemen. That means you lose the benefit of having ASEAN as the cooperative body or the communication point between these states as well as the regional actors in that instance. Let's take this for example. If Burma didn't have Malaysia or any of the, or Malaysia, Singapore or Brunei, Malaysia, in those countries in that region to engage with or any sort of economic cooperation, a friend, ladies and gentlemen, but faced with the world that condemned them and placed military sanctions, there was a very low likelihood that Burma would ever release any sort of concessions towards its own people or the military junta wanting to give up. We think that's extreme harm under that side. But secondly, we think that when ASEAN is unable to make a decision as to when they want to intervene, because acknowledging that this body will more often than not clash as to what they think is acceptable when to intervene, because some people may think it's worthy to intervene when there's a protest in Thailand, whereas others may think there is a higher standard to intervention. In that instance, Mr. Legalization, the harm to that is that it creates a perception of a toothless ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen. Why is that extremely harmful? Number one, there's no ability for ASEAN to reach a consensus, so therefore the perception is just like the United Nations where they can't reach consensus on much, ladies and gentlemen, that they can't do anything. We think that's harmful. But secondly, we think ASEAN in general and its member states don't have the military force in order to enforce much of the peacekeeping efforts that you want to talk about under that side of the house either. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that international communities often refer to local bodies that taunt themselves as a protector of the region, ladies and gentlemen. In that instance, there are many harms that harm ASEAN in this instance when they think they can handle the situation, but they can't. How so? Because it harms their negotiating power with the international community. When ASEAN is seen as a toothless body that not only can't protect itself, but not more so send troops out into foreign countries like AK wants, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's far harder for ASEAN to function as an economic bloc like they wanted to. The most threatening partner that ASEAN has in the region is China, ladies and gentlemen. More often than not, China pressures ASEAN countries into making certain concessions that are extremely harmful to them. The only way that China is empowered by this proposal is by showing that ASEAN isn't in solidarity ASEAN doesn't have the cooperation that it says it does, ladies and gentlemen, and more often than not, people will pull out of ASEAN. In that instance, we think China is more likely to capitalize on the fractures in between ASEAN states. In that instance, we think that's actually harmful to the interest, the original interest of ASEAN, that is the economic development for all, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's actually extremely important. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that it's important to acknowledge in this debate that ASEAN was never meant to be an intervening body or a binding body at that. It was always meant as a point of engagement for disparate states that never agree with each other, but with one common goal: economic development. We think when you make it more than that you want to intervene, we think that it's more likely that they won't cooperate. We are very proud to oppose.
Alright, let's thank the opposition leader and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to respond.
It's kind of ironic that the new opposition decides to talk about how ASEAN is going to be a toothless organization if we have this peacekeeping force, assuming that ASEAN's main criticism isn't already the fact that we are pretty toothless. The main criticisms going on about ASEAN have always been the fact that we take human rights as a corollary interest in most Southeast Asia, especially in comparison to the efforts that the UN has done. And the main reason is the acceptance of the fact that much of the kinds of cooperation that we do involves the goodwill of particular states. We don't see how a peacekeeping force that is there and ready to respond to conflict, to respond to natural disasters, and to ultimately provide peace, relief, and the establishment and protection of human rights in every circumstance where it is required is an organization that we shouldn't go for. We historically believe that if ASEAN believes in cooperation in the pursuit of human rights, which it does, especially since Burma decided to get on board with the project, this is an organization and a system we need to push forward and a direction ASEAN needs to go forward to. In my substantive, I'm going to talk about how this builds better social cohesion between ASEAN states, for the eventuality of ASEAN, improvement of ASEAN. Before that, yes.
Look, if there are different standards as to what you think is acceptable interventions, don't you think an intervention is a value judgment that you make onto that state, making it less likely to cooperate?
Let's go on to a few issues to address this point. First, and the biggest attack which this our head to our case, is can we ever reach a consensus to the extent it will ever be employed? The first thing we need to understand is really to analyze what situations and what circumstances peacekeeping forces will ever be used. The truth and reality is, we will never probably use it in places such as Singapore. Ironically, and perhaps very thankfully, we are safeguarded from the kinds of realities or natural disasters or kinds of conflict that may or may not happen or pose existential threats within ASEAN itself. In fact, the reality on the flip side is that it will be used in places that has seen such existential crises and have been used, and most importantly, has already seen the involvement of fellow ASEAN states within those places itself. It is hard for them to say that Singapore and Malaysian armies didn't take part within the issue of conflict within East Timor, and my own cousin was deployed there under the banner of the Singapore Armed Forces, which already says that the first thing Canada told you, as in every other peacekeeping forces, they will be deployed primarily with the consent of these particular parties. The next only question we need to ask ourselves is, will it be able to do so within an efficient amount of time? The implication that Mr. was trying to say is that we'll never be able to agree to instances in which we want to go in. The reality is we have, in many cases, we've already decided that there's humanitarian reasons already legitimize our presence there on both ends of the spectrum. No, thank you. But other instruments within ASEAN, with regards to economies, with regards to direct diplomatic relations and direct phone lines, have already made it easier to address these particular issues, especially with regards to the up-to-date kind of implementations that happen within Burma, especially within transitional years most recently. It wasn't a surprise that ASEAN decided to the joy of the international community to condemn the actions there, very much against its own mutual purposes. But it showed instances where ASEAN knows what its overall interest is in these particular circumstances. His next argument is, aren't the alternatives better? If the UN can do so, why not use the UN? Our response is, yes, that's great, but that isn't mutually exclusive from the fact that an ASEAN regional peacekeeping peacekeeping force, one, is considerably more efficacious in implementation and execution, and second of all, will considerably be more welcome than these external people who are part of the West and who are part of the great colonizing powers that ASEAN was created to deflect in the first place. So thank you. A big part of this instance was to reduce the reliance on external forces which created ASEAN. And we think a big part of that, and I'll tell you my perspective, is creating peacekeeping forces that can solve ASEAN issues in ways that ASEAN wants it to be. What is their case? Their case is to say that, well, this will encourage particular isolationist states, which begs the question of which remaining states in ASEAN are considerably isolationist anymore, to become even more isolationist. To which we must ask ourselves the fundamental question of what a peacekeeping force is. No, to which the conflation that Ms. Wang makes in the speech is that a peacekeeping force and intervention force by international law standards are fundamentally the same thing. On a plane, no thank you, they don't work under the same mandate. And that is not how UN peacekeeping forces operate within the concepts of UN international law to begin with. They can't intervene even if without the consent of the sovereign force or these individual parties. That is why the difference when it came to intervening in Iraq, these places required consensus by the UN to begin with, whereas peacekeeping forces are on standby to go in with or without these particular things. That is the international mechanism that makes a difference. That is why they could go into Rwanda, even though the French vetoed intervention and unilateral action within Rwanda in the first place. Peacekeeping forces were there, but the French in the Security Council very clearly rejected the intervention forces and therefore shows a clear distinction between these two. These two things can work unilaterally because people and countries undergoing an existential crisis can see what a peacekeeping force is there to do. That is why we don't think it will encourage any more isolationism, even if these things existed, which we don't think it does. The next thing he says is ASEAN is going to seem more like a toothless body. And this is where I go into my perspective. Everything is absolutely important was the development of ASEAN and the cohesion of ASEAN to move forward within the peacekeeping force in the first place. So thank you. We agree. A large majority of the kinds of discussion that goes on within ASEAN adopts a policy of consensus. But it doesn't mean that for the large part of time ASEAN has been formulated, it hasn't been willing to engage in constructive kinds of engagement with these individual parties, and forces. We think that peacekeeping force provides the mechanism in which we can continue to constructively engage and encourage group behavior to enable these particular instances to continue. That, for a large part, is how we got Burma on board. And by we think peacekeeping forces can enable that by providing the exact relief that is required to get them involved in this consequence. The first thing we already told you, is that if you agree that cohesion and discourse and dialogue is an important part of ASEAN solutions, then you need to be able to remove the fog of war. And we sometimes think that the actors involved aren't necessarily the people or politicians or the ASEAN body to begin with. That's what happened in the case of instances such as Filipino militants invading intrusions into Malaysia. The same thing happened with temples in Cambodia. I mean, these instances don't often incur political actors where you can create a discourse. But knowing that these individual instances don't incur political actors is important to begin with. We think therefore removing the fog of war, which is the point of these peacekeeping forces, enables this process and encourages dialogue to happen. The second reason why we think this is good, in alignment with everything else, all the developments that we made in ASEAN itself, is to encourage individual countries and to galvanize them behind the ASEAN effort to begin with. Without a force that says we can make a change, without a force that says that we can solve problems within ASEAN, the force of ASEAN nationals and Southeast Asian individuals who, unlike the leader of opposition, are in fact shared by a common destiny and a common beginning, a common history, insofar as we all share within the same colonistic regimes in the past. We think the difference is great. If you can show that we can provide solutions more than the way we are now by relying on bilateral aid and goodwill of others, we think this moves the ASEAN movement forward and galvanizes behind the banner of the protection of human rights. We don't think these circumstances or the states of rights involved are things that can be so flippantly reliant on the goodwill of other countries. We think ASEAN is important, the way forward is to create this force, and that's why we're happy to propose.
Okay, thank you, Didier, and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to respond.
Just a few random facts about ASEAN. It took ASEAN 5 years to agree on their logo. It took ASEAN 10 years to agree on their anthem, ladies and gentlemen. Now they want ASEAN to have a peacekeeping force and get people to discuss on when to intervene. We think that it is not effective, and we didn't see how opening government has shown that ASEAN peacekeeping force will be effective. Ladies and gentlemen, what they wanted in this debate was that all their arguments, if you notice, was in support of peacekeeping forces, not necessarily where ASEAN peacekeeping force will exclusively achieve those benefits, because we think any peacekeeping force, if they do intervene in these countries, can achieve the benefits that came from that side of the house. Now, in my speech, I will exclusively tell you why ASEAN peacekeeping force intervening within countries will create harms, ladies and gentlemen. I'll talk about a lot of things. On my paper now, there's about 4 things, and I'll try to walk you my way through with these 4 things. Firstly, let's look at what they said. They said that ASEAN peacekeeping force can only enter into sovereign states if the sovereign states consent to it. We think firstly it's going to be ineffective because it's never going to happen. The Myanmar government will never ever consent to allowing peacekeeping forces into ASEAN. But secondly, we think that this particular model can be abused by belligerent states like Myanmar, ladies and gentlemen. How is this so? In Myanmar, for example, with the ethnic conflicts that's going on, what Myanmar can do is that Myanmar can use the ASEAN peacekeeping force to enter and to help the people on the ground, but it is actually not fixing the root problem, because now the Myanmar government can just let off their hands and let this peacekeeping force be there, ladies and gentlemen. What's the problem then? That means the existence of peacekeepers there creates a false sense of security within this country, and it gives no incentive for the government to do any changes or help actually solve the root problem within Myanmar. Furthermore, it also shifts the spotlight from the actual problem, because now the international community thinks that Myanmar is alright with the existence of the peacekeepers there, ladies and gentlemen. So we think it is ineffective, and it can be abused to shift spotlight and to make governments appear to be responsible by agreeing to have these peacekeepers there and not actually dealing with the problem. Secondly, we think that conflict resolutions now becomes a lot slower, because now the burden is shifted towards ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen. Initially, when there is a problem, for example in Thailand or in Myanmar, ladies and gentlemen, the international community has a responsibility or takes on the responsibility to help people on the ground. Now what will happen is that the international community will go like, this is under the jurisdiction of ASEAN, and ASEAN should be doing something about it. And all the discussions that's going to happen in this conference, ladies and gentlemen, will take a long period of time, and because people will feel that ASEAN has a responsibility to do so, no one will want to take action. The international community will have plausible deniability, ladies and gentlemen, by saying that ASEAN should do it, we shouldn't do it. Especially when they're talking about how people are cutting down on military expenditure or war fatigue, ladies and gentlemen, where people don't want to intervene. It is easy for the international community now to shift the blame on ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen, making it look a lot worse. Thirdly, before I move on, yes.
Philippines and Malaysia were both reluctant to deal with the issue of militants going to Malaysia because they didn't want to deploy troops and look as though they were antagonistic towards the other side. Wouldn't this peacekeeping force be easily deployed to resolve the tension rather than to rely on the...
Yeah, but UN forces can be easily deployed as well. Even in fact, if a conflict happens, nations that are willing to go and help people on the ground can do it on their own accord outside the jurisdiction of ASEAN. Because if they do it within the jurisdiction of ASEAN, all the harms that we're talking about will materialize, ladies and gentlemen, and we don't want to risk ASEAN being exposed to this harm. Secondly, thirdly, we think that this will escalate tensions even further. Let's say the ASEAN forces enter into Myanmar or Thailand, ladies and gentlemen, and something goes wrong, like a mistake is done by a peacekeeper, for example, from Malaysia or Singapore, shot at a person, or the people attack the peacekeepers and they have to defend themselves. We think these kinds of things creates unnecessary tensions between the nations that are involved in the peacekeeping force. Because Thailand will feel like as if the Malaysian soldier that did that particular act is problematic, or if a Malaysian soldier is harmed, Malaysia will feel like they need to retaliate or will feel very defensive on the security of the peacekeeping forces there, ladies and gentlemen. We think these create unnecessary tensions that harms the cooperation within ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen. Lastly, we think that there are alternatives in order to deal with this problem. Why isn't the UN or NATO, ladies and gentlemen, or the coalition of the willing, sufficient in order to deal with this problem? Because they said it is a lot more difficult, or it takes a longer time in order for these peacekeepers to go in. we don't see how is it different if you have an ASEAN peacekeeping force, considering that people would not want to, consent to this, considering that we have diverse values and they're trying to create a prescription of values of what, is acceptable and what is not. We think it's going to be a long discussion and, it won't be efficient at the end of the day. In fact, we think that all the kind of benefits that you wanted to talk about in terms of cultural proximity, for example, can be achieved. If you send a UN peacekeeping force, and this has been taught by Mr. They always send people from that particular region, ladies and gentlemen, in order to create that sensitivity. Even you considered that your cousin from Singapore went into East Timor to create, because they are neighbors, ladies and gentlemen, because they understand the region better. We think that can work in these situations. And then they wanted to go into like a debate about natural disasters. We don't think that's an issue at all in this debate. Because when natural disasters happen, we don't need peacekeepers. Like people can naturally go into those countries and help those people, ladies and gentlemen. Like Malaysia sent help to Philippines when the hurricane happened. The international community and NGOs send help to these countries. So we don't think that that's an issue, ladies and gentlemen. But what we are risking now by scrapping the non-intervention policy is that a lot of diverse ASEAN countries get turned off by this. And this is a harm that wasn't responded by that side of the house. Like countries like Myanmar now will feel insecure that ASEAN anyone can intervene within their country, and ladies and gentlemen. And that is problematic because the harm